Philosopher and theologian Kenneth Richard Samples is Senior Research Scholar at Reasons to Believe. Kenneth worked for 7 years as Senior Research Consultant and Correspondence Editor at Christian Research Institute, where he regularly co-hosted the Bible Answer Man with renowned apologist Dr. Walter Martin. Please welcome Kenneth Richard Samples.
Thank you. I don't know about you, but I like to hear Gary Habermas trash talk. That was quite good. Well, who is this individual that's going to appear on the screen right there? Can anybody recognize that image? It's Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes was known as a careful thinker, right? What I'd like to do in my 30 minutes with you is to talk a little bit about careful thinking, because I think one of the most powerful arguments for the truth of Christianity is that Christianity can explain the most meaningful realities of life. So in the talk, I'm going to look a little bit at what is a good explanation, and then how does that explanation zero in on some pretty powerful realities like beauty, love, and human longing. So this is really, I think, an approach that is unique, because essentially it's saying if Christianity is true, it should be able to explain the nature of reality. Now I'm going to begin with two stories. One of them is pretty ordinary. The other is pretty dramatic, at least for me. So the first story is this. Imagine you're sleeping in on Saturday morning. Of course, you're not this week. You're here at the AMP conference. But suppose you're sleeping in on Saturday morning. You had a long week, and you're groggy, and you peek open through the blinds, and you see that the streets are wet. What is your immediate inference to explain the streets being wet? Yeah, that's exactly what you do. That is, in a nutshell, abductive reasoning. Whenever you see something, you're asking the question, how do I explain that reality? How do I explain that reality? And of course, this is something we do instinctively. We do it naturally. I'm going to argue that this is really the way God intended us to reason. This is the way we think. We see a phenomenon. We search our minds to explain that reality. Now, of course, you have to be careful, because on Tuesday mornings in my neighborhood, you have a street sweeper that comes along, and that'll wet the street. So there are anomalies that come along. Now, the other story is more dramatic. It relates to me as a person. I had a life-threatening illness 11 years ago, and I remember coming home from work. It was a Wednesday, and I had a bad headache. I felt kind of sick to my stomach, and I went to bed, and my wife said I didn't wake up for 3 days. Now, what happened was she took me to the doctor, and the doctor said, I don't know what's wrong with your husband, and I can't treat him until we do discover what's wrong with him. He could have stage 4 brain cancer, and he said, if that's the case, there isn't anything we can do. He said there may be another explanation. It could be a bacterial infection, which could also kill your husband. But if it's bacteria, we can treat it. So I remember having a large lesion in my right lung. At the time, I didn't know what a lesion was, but ultimately they took part of my right lung out in order to determine whether it was bacterial, because every time they wanted to test it, they ultimately failed. My lung would collapse. So I had one large lesion, but I had 6 of them in my brain, 6 brain lesions. Now, what's interesting is, to the degree that I could think carefully, I was kind of tracking what the doctors were doing, because at one point I had 4 doctors. And at one time they were outside of my hospital bed, and I could hear them talking, and they were reasoning abductively. They said, you know, if he has this, we should expect to see these symptoms, but we don't. And then another doctor would pop up and give another alternative. So the doctors were reasoning abductively. They looked at the symptoms. They came up with a diagnosis that it was indeed an infection. They treated me with antibiotics for 6 months. I had to take 20 antibiotic pills every day for 6 months. And then what resulted? I was cured. Now, I remember having many MRIs and brain scans, and one of the technicians said to me, "Would you like to see your brain?" That's not my brain, by the way. Mine's bigger. No, it's this humility stuff that's so difficult, you know. But I remember seeing my brain. I remember thinking to myself, St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas never got to see their brain. But I was very fortunate. I remember one doctor saying, I said, what if you can't treat the brain lesions? He said, well, we can come in and drill holes in your head. And I thought, I'm a philosopher. Let's wait. Let's try something other than that. So this is a careful thought process. And what all of this brought to my mind is this abductive type of reasoning. This is the way all careful people think. This is an intuitive way of thinking. Doctors study multiple symptoms. They look at the test results. They come up with a cause-effect explanation, and they propose a diagnosis. That is what we mean by explanatory hypothesis. They were able to treat me. I was healed. And of course, medicine is a good gift of Almighty God. And so the Lord used medicine to heal me, to cure me. And I'm the beneficiary of very careful thinking and good medicine and a lot of grace from God, right? Now, another doctor said to me, he's my doctor now. I don't know whether he is a Christian or not. I've never had an in-depth discussion with him. I hope to. But he looked at my chart and he looked at me and he said, someone must have been watching over you. And I thought, doctors aren't supposed to say things like that. But I later read that people who have multiple abscess brain lesions, the mortality rate is 80%. 80%. Okay, so thinking process. Scientists, doctors, they reason inductively. That's more probabilistic. Abductive reasoning has to do with what's more plausible, what is the best explanation. Here is a standard text written by a British philosopher who reasons from inference to the best explanation. So this type of reasoning is used in all kinds of fields, in science, in medicine, and again, it moves from what is the best explanation, a series of data, and then proposes how to best explain those things. Now, what's interesting about Sherlock Holmes is that often he would use the expression that he was engaged in deductive reasoning. He wasn't. He was engaged in abductive reasoning. And some of you know J. Warner Wallace, who has a terrific book looking at Christianity from the standpoint of being a detective. That's exactly what Sherlock Holmes was doing, looking at the crime scene and coming up with an explanation for it. So again, what is the best explanation for the existence of a particular given phenomenon is the direction we want to go. Here is another standard logic text, Oxford Press, The Power of Critical Thinking. Vaughan goes into abductive reasoning. He proposes that this is a type of inductive reasoning. Again, showing you that this is a standard way in which logicians, careful thinkers, reason. So instead of asking about certainty or probability, people who engage in this form of reasoning talk about plausibility. What's the most plausible explanation? And again, what's critical here is that part of this has to do with adding inference and imagination. That word imagination ought to make you think about C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, in his writings, reasons abductively. He was doing it 50 years ago, looking at the nature of reality and proposing a Christian explanation for it. So let's summarize this a little bit. This is kind of a diagnostician, right? A person who engages in diagnosis. Logicians do it, philosophers do it, detectives, historians, physicians, scientists, engineers. In fact, how many engineers do we have out here today? I've been thinking recently that an engineering thinking is very similar to the way the Creator must have done things. Because the Creator not only has to think about it hypothetically, but it has to work in the real world. that kind of abductive way of thinking. And mechanics. My father was a automobile mechanic. I remember as a boy, our neighbor would pull their car up into the driveway, and my dad would just open the hood, listen to the engine for a few minutes, and then he would say, "It's the carburetor. It's the transmission. It's this or that." And I thought as a child, my dad is a shaman. I mean, how many kids have a father who can listen to an engine and just tell you what's wrong with it? Well, my dad wasn't a shaman. My dad was a diagnostician. My dad knew enough about the engine and the way it works to realize it's exhibiting these symptoms, and I know from experience that's the carburetor. This is a natural way of reading. It's a foundational way of reasoning. And what I think is really important about this is a lot of times non-Christians think Christians engage in special pleading and special reasoning. But what I'm setting forth here today, and what many Christians have asserted for a very long time, is that this is the most natural way we can reason. And when we do it, and when we do it well, we can make a powerful argument for Christianity. Here's a quote from another text on abductive reasoning. It says, "This occurs in such diverse places as medical diagnosis, scientific theory formation, accident investigation, language understanding, and jury deliberation." That's how powerful this is. Here's a text that applies it to artificial intelligence, to computation. This is a very important area of thought. So thinking like a detective, thinking like a doctor, thinking like somebody who is trying to solve a problem. And I think that when we take this abductive approach, we can make a powerful argument for Christianity. So I'm going to attempt to do just that. Now, an argument is, of course, something that happens in the car between you and your spouse. No, that's a different kind of argument, right? But a logical argument really is a very simple thing. You just have to have two things. You have to make a claim, we call that the conclusion, and you have to support the claim. If you make a claim but you don't support it, you just have an opinion. Nothing wrong with opinions. They just don't prove anything or verify anything. If you have a bunch of data, but you don't make a claim, then you just have rich information. You've got to make a claim and you've got to support it. So here's my argument. Premise one, premise is the support. The universe and life exhibits diverse, complex, and meaningful realities. Things like love. Things like human longing, right? Beauty. And we could add all kinds of other things like the beginning of the universe, its fine-tuning, ethics, the life of Jesus. We could add many things to that. Premise number two, the Christian theistic God and worldview revealed in the Bible best explains these realities individually and cumulatively. So our conclusion, therefore, the Christian theistic God and worldview is most plausibly and likely to be true. Again, it's not certain. This is not deduction. This is not geometry. But the most plausible explanation is quite likely to be the true explanation. Now let's apply this in some specificity here. This is, again, not a religious type of reasoning. Christians don't reason in a special way. We reason normally and naturally, just like everybody else does. So we're going to look at what this has to say about the Christian worldview, and I'm going to go right to it here. Here is stating it in a more technical way. How well does a worldview explain the facts of reality? That's its power. How wide is the range of explanation, that scope? I think Christianity can explain a lot. When I'm driving on the freeway in Southern California, the way people drive makes me think the Bible is true. People really are sinners. It may, however, be support for evolution because it's the survival of the fittest, right? But you think of somebody like a Blaise Pascal. Pascal says humans are great and wretched. Great because they're made in the image of God. Wretched because they're fallen. How do you explain that combination, that eerie combination? Well, here's Bill Wainwright. He's an academic philosopher, happens to be a Christian. He says metaphysical theories, just think worldview at that point, are better when they explain a wide range of phenomena A system that illuminates humanity's scientific, moral, aesthetic, and religious experience, for example, is superior to the one that illuminates science only. And I think that captures the strength of Christianity. Christianity seems to provide an adequate explanation of things like morality, aesthetics, religious experience, and as our science guys will tell you, it fits with the scientific data as well. So we have explanatory power as well as a broad scope of explanation. Now, of course, the atheists come along, and atheism is not a worldview. Atheism is a denial of God. The worldview that holds up atheism is called naturalism. So according to the secular worldview of naturalism, evolution runs on the track of survivability. Now, this is a critical idea that's central to everything that I'm about to say. The focus of naturalism, the engine that pushes naturalism, or naturalistic evolution, I should say, is survivability. The species evolves, and it is in a position to be able to survive. As Francis Crick said, humans have the ability to throw rocks, pick bananas, and run faster than the creature that wants to eat them. But it doesn't necessarily guarantee that their minds will give them truth and reality. So let's apply this to the question of artistic beauty and sacrificial love. I mean, how important is love and beauty? How important is beauty in life? And when you think about the people you love, how important is a sacrificial love, loving unconditionally? Well, here's the question. What if artistic beauty and sacrificial love do nothing to add to the species' survivability? In fact, philosophers call this non-utilitarian or non-useful values. Why is the world so beautiful, and why is love so important? How could that come to be in a naturalist universe where these things don't really do much to help us survive? In fact, here's a Christian philosopher, William Davis. Notice what he says. He says, if everything, including humanity, is the result of random impersonal forces which encourage only survival, then it seems highly unlikely that the process would yield organisms, humans, which recognize values like these, artistic beauty and sacrificial love, which aren't survival conducive. And so the amazing thing is, if God doesn't exist, and we are the product of this blind mechanistic process, the amazing thing is that you and I have the capacity to detect beauty, and you and I are driven by the sense of sacrificial love, but it does nothing to help us survive. And so it seems out of place in a naturalist universe. It seems inexplicable in a naturalistic universe. Davis continues, he says, but values like these are what we would expect if humans and the human environment were created by a personal, loving, and beauty-valuing God. God's existence is a much better explanation for the existence of non-utilitarian value than any explanation without God. This is where the rubber meets the road. Does your worldview provide insight? Does your worldview bring you closer to reality? In a Christian worldview, you expect things like beauty because God is himself the greatest beautiful being. God is not only an engineer, but he's an artist. And what would we expect from a God who is one God in three persons? The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit love each other for all eternity. And then when it comes to create, that love spills over onto us. A couple of days ago, I was on Twitter, and I asked a Muslim, I said to him, who did Allah love in eternity before he created angels and human beings? And he had a really difficult time answering that question. Dr. Ross and I were talking to two Jewish fellows in an evangelistic context. I said, I want to leave you with one question. Who did Yahweh love? Because remember, while we look back at the Old Testament and think of Yahweh as being the triune God. Traditional Judaism says that Yahweh is one being, one person. Well, who does Yahweh love in eternity before creation? And both of the Jews said nothing for 90 seconds, which was a virtual miracle, I can tell you that. These guys were talkers, right? Well, in a Christian worldview, you don't have any difficulty explaining love. God is analogous to a family. God is a community of persons. And in fact, in the Middle Ages, when the monks would get together and they would engage in what we call harmonizing, it was to reflect the Trinity, 3 voices singing as one. That's what you expect in a Christian worldview. But from a naturalist worldview, now here's another philosopher, Paul Copan, Christian. He says, impressive natural beauty is in no way linked to survival. So why think this overwhelmingly beauty should exist given naturalism? And this is a great quote from Paul. He says, why isn't everything functional, monotonously textured, and battleship color? But it's not. My wife drags me out of the house every other night to look at the sunset. She has this deep sense that there is beauty in nature. She sees the beauty there. And why do we do that? Copan again says, and why should human creatures exist who can admire and appreciate the world's loveliness and majesty? And why do scientists prefer elegant or beautiful theories, often without observational support? Hugh Ross was the first one to inform me that equations were beautiful. I never thought they were beautiful. But you know what? It's not just the Christians who see this. Here's Paul Draper, a leading philosopher, skeptic, leaning toward atheism. Notice what Draper says about this. Theism is supported by the fact that the universe contains an abundance of beauty. A beautiful universe, especially one containing beings that can appreciate that beauty, is clearly more likely on theism than on naturalism. This is a very powerful way of reasoning. And at the end of the day, what's more important than things like beauty? I would argue that we can explain such things because we're made in the image of God. Part of the image of God is our ability to appreciate beauty and to appreciate love, agape. I'm not going to take the time to read this quote, but the New Dictionary of Theology says that agape, this unique love that Jesus talked about, that Paul talked about in his epistles, this sacrificial love is very different than the love that you'd find in the Greco-Roman world. In fact, Houston Smith, one of the leading scholars of the world religions, Smith contrasted the gods of the Greco-Roman era, the gods on Mount Olympus. He said those gods were looking always to seduce the maidens. But the God from Sinai, he was caring about orphans and widows, the powerless. This kind of sacrificial love. Why should I engage in sacrificial love if that's not going to help me survive? In fact, that seems to work completely against my survival. But in a Christian context, we recognize that love is critical. By the way, this 1 Corinthians 13 segment, I thought Paul came up with this. But there is an indication that this was some kind of hymn or some kind of statement that Christians were reciting even before Paul became a Christian. It goes back, as Gary Habermas has talked about, to that primitive time of Christianity. Love is not a mere alternative. Love is such a critical idea. Now, I want to hit one more thing. I want to talk a little bit about restlessness, or our sense of longing and restless. I can tell you from my own personal life that when I was a young man, I was really searching. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I was restless. I knew something was missing in my life. I thought if I met the right woman, maybe that would solve this sense of restlessness. Or if I became a professional athlete, if I had some accomplishment, maybe I would feel this sense of a sense of peace rather than restlessness. But the problem is that our family experienced a catastrophe. My older brother, who was a hippie, who experimented with drugs and in fact became addicted to serious drugs. He also had a history of mental health challenges. He was incarcerated. At 27 years old, my brother took his life. I was 19 at the time, and I can tell you, all I could think about were the existential big questions of life. Why am I here? Why did this happen? Will I ever see my brother again? Do I have anything? I couldn't offer anything to him. I don't have anything for myself. And it was those questions that really the Lord began to use to open up my life. And I began to realize that restless longing has a long history among Christian pilgrims. St. Augustine, I think, is the best theologian outside of the New Testament. I think he is a terrific theologian. Notice what he says in his book, The Confessions. He modeled this after the Psalms, by the way, so he's just talking to God. He says, "Man is one of your creatures, Lord, and his instinct is to praise you. The thought of you stirs him so deeply that he cannot be content unless he praises you, because you made us for yourself, and our hearts find no peace until they rest in you." That was St. Augustine's problem too. So 1,500 years before me, there were people asking, what is my meaning and purpose in life? Cornelius Plantinga, another theologian, has this to say. He says, "Our sense of God runs in us like a stream. Even though we divert it toward other objects, we human beings want God even when we think what we really want is a green valley or a good time from our past or a loved one." We're made for God. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity says that just like cars run on gasoline, we were made to run on God. We were made to be fueled by God. And when you're alienated from God, when you're out of fellowship with God, when you don't know the Lord, then you're going to experience this deep sense of restlessness because nothing else will fulfill us. Here's Jack Lewis. That was the very version that I read for the first time. My sister gave me a copy of Mere Christianity. I read it, and the first thing I thought, I never knew that Christians could be so careful in their thinking. I always thought Christians are feelers. They're not thinkers. And I discovered in Lewis a very careful thinker, and he talked about the argument from desire. Lewis said that we're hungry. Well, there is something outside of us, food, that can satisfy that. We get thirsty. There's water. You can drink. You can find fulfillment of your thirst. You have sexual desires. Well, there is such a thing as sex. But he then says, but we have this desire to live forever. We have this desire for eternity. But nothing can fulfill it. And he concludes, we must have been created for another world. Now, this is an interesting argument. You might say this is more on the inner side. This is more the aesthetic side. My colleagues talk a lot about the beginning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe. Fuzz talks about design in the cell. But there are all these other kind of aesthetic elements that need explanation. And again, here's Peter Kraft, who puts it into a form of an argument that the best explanation of reality can be found in the person of Christ. In fact, let's take a look at that for just a minute. Premise 1, every natural, innate desire in us corresponds to some objective that can satisfy that desire. Premise 2, but there exists in us desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, no creature can satisfy. Conclusion, therefore there must exist something more than time, earth, and creatures which can satisfy this desire. This is a very powerful way of reasoning, and it's abductive. What is the best explanation for these realities? Beauty, sacrificial love, human longing, they're expected features in the Christian. The world is what we would expect if it was made by the triune God of Christianity. On the other hand, in naturalism, these features, they're foreign, they're out of place, and they're ultimately left unexplained. What are the takeaways? What are the takeaways? Talk to your non-Christian friends. Talk to them about how your faith tends to make sense of reality. Sacrificial love, it makes sense. Beauty makes sense. That longing that all of us, and many of us have the longing and we're not willing to admit it. We hold it inside us. But that longing can be explained. And number two, secular naturalism seems really incapable of explaining these critical issues. I've written about these topics in both of these books. If you're interested in the logic side, if you want to know how abductive reasoning differs from inductive and deductive, then you want A World of Difference. If you want to see how these are crafted into an argument to support God in terms of things like beauty and love, then you want 7 Truths That Change the World. I think a powerful way of reasoning for the truth of our faith is that Christ and the gospel makes the best sense of you and me and all of the realities of life. Thank you very much.